God's truth, not our own. That we're calling for lots of different opinions and perspectives, not just the black and the white, right, but the gray and the in between.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, Phil, I was really happy that you were in the pulpit yesterday. Friends, if you haven't watched it, haven't had a chance to watch worship yesterday, you can do so at our Facebook page or on our YouTube channel. I know Phil will be pulling out his sermon and posting that on the podcast channel and also on our YouTube channel. So make sure that you go back and listen to Phil's preaching, but also experience worship. We know it's been a really tense week, and it was just good to be with my people on Sunday virtually, and knowing that we were all holding that same space. And so yeah, thank y'all for giving this new dad, not new dad,
a little bit of breathing room.
Yeah, just thanks for giving me some space over the.
You are a new dad. You're a new dad in a new way.
New dad to Declan and
right.
same dad to Cashel. So it was good to be online, and oh man, I know that there's a lot of reasons we should be in the Facebook feed, to watch, because there's so much chatter and action going on in the comment section. But man, throwing it up on the YouTube on the TV, like it is good. It's
a really good experience.
Yeah, it's a really good experience for sure. So if you haven't watched this yet, use your smart TV or something and check us out on the YouTube channel. It's really good.
Yeah, we started a new series yesterday, long time coming, called Faithful Friction, and yesterday's theme, which we didn't really name too often much, but I think it came through, was listen well. So we're going through listen well, and then forgive well, and then love well. And so, we really tried to cultivate from the Sunday sit down with Lisa Hancock. And I say very lovingly, the other Lisa Hancock, because that's how I keep them straight.
Right.
Lisa Hancock that is one of our community. She sings in the choir, and she and Reverend Justin Hancock, they've been involved for a long time. But the other Lisa Hancock, it was funny. I talked to her on Sunday and said, "Oh, it's nice to finally meet you. I'm friends with Lisa Hancock, who is doing her PhD at Perkins." She said, "Oh yeah, I get emails that are meant for her all the time."
Oh, I bet.
Well, it's funny because one of the first times I ever tried to reach out to this Lisa Hancock, I accidentally emailed the other Lisa Hancock from our community for the same reason, because they both have massive involvements at SMU as well. So
right. And they're very similar spirits, I feel like. I mean, Lisa that spoke yesterday just brought so much wisdom, and I felt like a calmness. I, for one, am completely exhausted this week. I don't know how y'all are feeling, but just
put me in, Coach.
Whew. So it was really a great conversation that you guys opened up that you'll have 2 more weeks of.
Yeah.
But then Josh and Victoria brought it out in the call to worship, where I've been trying to do this more often, and I hope that it comes across as a grounding piece for us, that I keep similar calls to worship throughout series. I don't change them every week so they're brand new, because I want people to have a chance to live with the words a little bit. But yesterday we really experienced that when Josh and Victoria brought it, because this pattern that I really find effective is, you have heard it said, which is what Jesus does in Matthew 5. But it calls us to really examine, what messages are we getting from the world, or from our neighbors and family, and then in contrast, what messages are we getting from Jesus himself and from Scripture, and from the wisdom tribes, So we're going to stick with that language for the next couple of weeks. I really encourage you, if the beginning of worship is a little harried for you, and you miss the call to worship, go back and listen to it. Really hunker down and listen to the words, because I think that, at least I hope that it's meaningful to set us up for the whole day.
Yeah, this is what I love about Jesus too, is just when we think we figured it out, Jesus shifts on us, right? And brings us what we need for any moment we find ourselves in. And right now, for so many of us, we're exhausted, we're worn out. We want to make sure that we can find some some space spiritually and emotionally. I feel like we've invested so much over the past several months in the political arena that, you know, now that we're kind of on the other side of it, it's time, you know, Jesus is calling us to more and less at the same time. And yeah, I thought the call did a good job of capturing that really, really well. And Rebecca you do a great job with taking some of Jesus's pedagogy and then allowing that to be our words and our context, but it is the way of Jesus of teaching and of examining, getting folks to examine themselves and culture that I think was really evident in this past call.
Yeah, and something that really came forward for me for this one is it feels like a very proverbial series.
Mm-hmm.
So I went through the Proverbs, and there are a lot of Proverbs about anger and conflict. But they all seem, I have trouble with Proverbs. Somebody can help me through this maybe, but they all seem kind of trite. Like if people embroidered pillows in the biblical times, like it would just be a bunch of pillows embroidered with short, kind of almost nonsensical phrases, but grounding them in the context of other scriptures. So like the words of James, the words of Jesus, that helps me. So hopefully it helps somebody else too. You know, you can read a proverb that says, don't let the sun go down upon your anger. But what does that mean, right? What does that mean when you're frustrated and angry? Is it literal? Is it figurative? So, you know, I'm teaching myself as much as I'm teaching anybody else.
Totally.
Well, there's the assumption that wisdom only applies one way, or that there's only one kind of wisdom.
Right.
When in all actuality, like there are a multitude of wisdoms to be applied to every situation.
Sure.
And we even see that within the scriptures, right? Like Proverbs, I once heard it said Proverbs is kind of the elementary version of wisdom, and then Ecclesiastes is like high school, and then you get to Job and you're like in postdoctorate work kind of going on. You know?
Yeah, that's a good word.
Mm-hmm. So yeah. I'm totally changing pace here with the next thing that we did in worship, and that was the statement of faith. And I'm only saying this because whenever I saw Kaylee's background pop up, I just like my heart, like it cheered at the same time and was like, "Oh, darn you, Kaylee! Why is your background so beautiful?"
Yeah, that is not a virtual background. Those are actual.
Those are real trees
in the Northeast. I forget where he is.
Yeah.
Massachusetts. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which I loved so much because it was a reminder to me that our community is spread way further and wider than just East Dallas, which I kind of touched on a little bit in my sermon too. But it's just a good reminder, right, that we are living in this digital world and that we are spread far and wide.
Yeah. Totally. And we got that in the comments too when I announced Advent boxes. We got somebody who was like, "That sounds awesome, but I don't live in Dallas."
Right.
Like, hey, we'll ship it to you. Yeah. So I hope we can make that work. You know, we can't do it probably for everybody who listens in from other places, but hopefully we can. If you want an Advent box, there's going to be a craft that you can build your own Advent wreath, which I'm excited about. And there'll be a devotional and a little hot cocoa kit and just some, you know, a balance of things that are spiritual, but also just comforting. So sign up for one at wrumc.org/adventbox, and we'll try to ship you one if you're not local.
Yeah, I think we could figure out a way to ship anyone that wanted one that's not local. We'll make it happen.
Totally.
We'll make it happen.
The USPS.
That's right. Needs support right now. For sure. Yeah,
well,
okay.
I want to get into your sermon.
Okay, sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah, I was going to talk about the Brilliant song as kind of our grounding, because we're going to use that over and over again, right, Rebecca?
Yeah. And I don't think we can get. Why don't we talk about that? Because I think it's a good foundation for what you were saying, but Rebecca's rewritten. You just essentially changed out some language, but I mean, the Brilliant song in and of itself is really, really powerful.
Totally.
It's a beautiful song.
Yeah.
And you've just made it more culturally appropriate for our congregation, which I think is, you know, helpful. How do you think when you listen to this like song or you perform this song, like as someone listening to it before we get into the words, like it just I start to melt a little bit. It's probably one of the like 5 songs that we do enough that like it really pushes me into a spiritual place probably quicker than anything else we do. Do you get
another one for me that's in that category is Serin on My Knees.
right? Serin on My Knees.
The Brianna album. Sorry.
Mark Miller, I Dream of a Church, when the choir does that, or when we sing Draw the Circle Wide.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of really hymns that I've just traveled with me throughout my life. And in this song, this brilliant song, do you get that when you're not performing, when you are leading the music? Do you also feel that? Do you have those feelings, or are you still kind of like making sure that the leading is going well?
It's both. I think when I'm in person with the choir or the folk band, I'm more able to allow the music to wash over me because there's trust in the room, and we can feel the tempo together when we're confined by recording. And I don't mean that in a bad way. Sure. Technology has been incredibly expansive during all this. So, but in that way, when we are confined by the recording, I have to be more conscious of, am I keeping the tempo correct? Am I staying perfectly in tune? Because it's going to be more evident if I'm a little flat or sharp over a recording than it is in person. So I would say it's both, but the hope is that the music helps me to worship, that it's not me leading, but as I like to pray with the choir before we go into worship, that get us out of the way. So that we are the ones, receiving it as much as anything. Because it always makes me really sad. You guys have probably had this too, where church leaders say, I don't really worship on Sundays. I'm just working. And that just breaks my heart.
Yeah. I think it's this like...
You're going to break Rebecca's heart right now?
No. I understand that feeling. But I think that's why, like, one of the reasons we invest so much into our work is so that we can create this worship experience or be co-creators, better put, or be conduits for God's grace and love in the world, right? We're not the creators of that. We are reflecting that. But I think when I hear particular songs, or when I get to experience Rebecca's work in worship, then I get a part of worship becomes worship for me.
Sure. Yeah.
I will say though, when we are the ones, like, it's hard for me to, it's hard to hear a sermon and preach a sermon at the same time.
Totally. No. And I don't mean to say that it's
during the week and then you preach it. Like as a preacher, I mourn not hearing good preaching in person live.
Sure. No, I get that. And I think it's a both and. I mean, when you kind of corrected yourself and you said, well, not performing, there is an aspect of performing.
Sure, totally.
That's not a bad thing. But I get what you mean. Like, we do have to be in it. We have to be focused mentally. And so I don't often, let myself just let go and be moved to tears or be moved, into a real meditative state. But this song, Brother, it's a beautiful song on its own. I don't want to say that it was lacking anything. It was very simple for that's what it was purposed for. And so when I arranged it, really expanding it was to just create some more breathing space. All that they wanted to say was, when I look into the face of my enemy, I see my brother. That was it. And that's simple, and it's so effective. Something that I always hear is, how can we expand at the edges to allow more people to see their own reflections? Yeah. So I added, I see my sister, I see my father, my mother, but also, who are we looking around and seeing as potential enemies? Is it strangers? Is it people we don't trust?
No.
Is it refugees? Is it anybody in the room when I say each one of us? So we are going to sing that every week, this series. Hopefully so people get to know it a little bit better.
Yeah, I wanted to bring it up just because I told you yesterday, Rebecca, that song had been like in my head playing over and over again as I was crafting the sermon too. Mm-hmm. So I think it's not only a grounding piece for the worship series as a whole, but it's just been a grounding piece for me as I prepared for preaching. So
and I think it allows us to to take on some responsibility for those who, when they look into the face of others, can't see their brother or sister or sibling or parent, right? Like there's a hope that we can always get there, but I am reminded of those, and I think, Phil, this kind of, you touched on this too, around non-negotiables. There are some folks, when they look into the face, they see an abuser or something of that, like, extreme. And like, the challenge, I think, is for us who have the capacity right now in any given moment. It's kind of what I say about the statement of faith, right? Like, at any one time, we may not always believe everything in there, but as collectively, we can say that too. And I think this is why community is so important, because we can be that source of reconciliation or peace for folks who may not be able to be there in that moment, right? And I think, like, that pendulum swinging back and forth is always going to exist, and our job is to make sure the pendulum, when it swings, is not does not cause chaos, right? And we can point to where we're headed and where we've been, knowing that there are going to be some folks that are not going to enjoy that journey, and we shouldn't say, it's okay. You can look in, I think of family, right? And that's what I'll talk about next week. Like, families are very complicated things. And there's some of our folks who going home for the holidays is a traumatic experience that they keep doing because they feel obligated to do it. But there may be a time where, like, they just can't do that. They can't look at their parents and see a mother or a father, right? They look into the face of their parents and they see someone who has made their life very, very hard because of who they love, for example, right?
Sure.
And, like, as a person of faith, like, we have a role to kind of hold that space for them and say, like, this isn't all on you, right? Like, you don't have to be perfect in your we're trying to be, but you don't have to be yet perfect in your pursuit of reconciliation. As a community, we're going to walk alongside you. And I think the diversity that Rebecca added into the song allows for that complexity to be even more rich, and we can become even more aware of it. And Phil, I think it was what, you said in your sermon, like, we definitely want to move towards a place of peace and understanding, and we want to listen really well. Something Lisa Hancock said in the sit down, but the truth is there are non-negotiables on the table too, right?
I think what spoke to me most, though, Phil, is we're all guilty of this. I am too, of accidentally starting with the non-negotiables instead of starting with the goal. I think that's where we get turned on our heads sometimes. We're like, well, I can't be friends with them because this is what I believe. Check, 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 check.
Right.
And you can get out of my life if you don't agree with that. And totally. I'm not speaking of the times when, yes, it's healthy for somebody to sever a relationship.
Sure.
I'm speaking of the times that I think probably are more common for a lot of us when we let our mental checklist take precedent over a human in front of us.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's happened for me this past week. So, as I've entered into conversations about politics. So, Phil, I appreciated you grounding us, kind of orienting. I saw somebody in the comments saying, like, thank you for reorienting the compass. That it is about, what is our goal? My goal is to love my neighbor. If you start there and then you get to how do I do it?
Yeah.
That makes
Well, and if you really play out, like, the full idea of love your neighbor is really love your neighbor as you love yourself, right? And it's important to realize that to be able to love your neighbor, you have to love yourself also. And so if you don't establish those non-negotiables or you overlook them, then you end up not loving yourself and putting yourself in harmful situations that don't allow you then to be able to love your neighbor either. So, I didn't really flesh that out in the sermon of it. Like that, I was reminded there are so many things that get cut right on the cutting block of a sermon writing that is just so hard for me. But that's the other important part of that, right? Is that I think the non-negotiables help you establish yourself to be able to, and thanks for saying that, Rick. Like, you have to understand your goal and then your non-negotiables. And part of that goal, if it really is this idea of loving your neighbor as you love yourself, is tied so closely to those non-negotiables. And if you don't stick to them, then you're not going to be able to love anybody, including yourself.
Yeah. and I think like the challenge with the non-negotiables piece is it does lend itself to making assumptions.
What kind of assumptions?
Like, if we just assume that everyone who is X political party or
Right.
right,
Totally.
that then they're going to check our non-negotiable box. And I think
Yes.
and I think the challenge is when we start with non-negotiables, then we never get to a place of listening because we're in a place of self-preservation.
Mm-hmm.
I also recognize it's a pretty privileged place for me to speak from, right?
Sure.
Like and so I think the challenge is to also spur the congregation forward while also letting those who need the specific spaces of a severing or of a break or of not engaging right now to happen, while also knowing that that's also pastoral, while
Sure.
also saying like, no, not everyone gets that, right? Like not everyone is in a place where they need that space. We have to do the work, the majority of the work, and the majority of folks, we need to stay really, really, the vast majority, we need to stay really, really engaged with people. I mean, I do know people who are just heartbroken and really disturbed, who are marginalized spaces, occupy marginalized spaces within our community, who are really disturbed that the election was even this close. And so I can't expect them to be like, oh no, you need to go out and right. Like I know what I need to do, and I know what we need to do as a community. And when we do that work, hopefully we can create the space for them to enter into conversation when they're ready. So
Yeah.
it's like, it's this both and thing that I think is so challenging, because we can't make declarative statements about you should do this or you should do that, right? Or don't do this or don't do that, while also recognizing that Jesus calls us to a universal place of loving our enemies and loving our neighbors, loving ourselves. And I think like that is what's been swirling around in my head, and your sermon helped me sort of begin to prioritize that in a really good way. And so I'm hoping that for our congregation, your preaching yesterday and the worship service as a whole was a way for us to kind of take an inventory of not only how we're feeling, but then begin to like categorize those feelings and prioritize certain actions based off of what the past week's been for us.
So I will say, Phil, you managed with it was a great beginning of your sermon where you were like kind of doing a mock argument. You managed to freak out Dexter and me to a very pronounced level. So if you guys did not see the behind the scenes, which you didn't, nobody but Lisa Hancock saw the behind the scenes.
Right.
Phil, you did this, you were like facing one way and arguing and then facing the other way. But when you first started, Dexter and I locked eyes, and Dexter's like, he's looking at the wrong camera. What in the world? He knows better. Like, why is he not looking? And then Dexter tried to get your attention, and you were just laser focused on what you were saying, which good for you.
Well, yeah, I was trying. It was hard to not just break it and be like, hold on, I'm doing something here. Which is just a lack of communication between me as this presenter and the production team. But anyway, yeah.
So it was funny. I mean, if you could have been a fly on the wall, like it was like Dexter was trying to get your attention, and then he looked at me. He's like, "Can you go stand behind the camera that he's supposed to look into?" So I was getting up, and then there was this moment where Dexter and I both got what you were doing. We were like, "Oh, I'm gonna go sit now."
That's good.
Yeah. I didn't really know if it would work on camera or not, and I forgot to frame it out to see like where can I actually move.
Right,
so
right.
I didn't go back and look and see what it worked or not. But
I'm sure it worked.
Hopefully people got what was happening.
Yeah, you raised Dexter's and my pulse a little bit there for a second.
Sure.
He's like, is he going to preach for 20 minutes looking at the wrong camera?
Right, which would be something I would probably do.
So anyway, just a little tidbit behind the scenes. But yeah, I mean, so Mitchell, not to challenge what you said at all, but just to counter it, I would say I did not feel any of the "you should" from Phil or from the worship service yesterday. I felt a very invitational, like I tried to do with the altar display, right? We had the black and the white, but then we have the middle grounds.
Yeah.
So I felt like it was a good space for a lot of different people. I know people who are really joyful and people who are really heartbroken by the election results. And so I think, like, I don't know, it felt like a space to breathe for me yesterday. And I hope that that was the case for others.
Yeah, totally. I'm not saying it wasn't at all. I'm just saying, and in fact, I'm just saying I thought Phil did a really good job of creating that very specifically in his sermon by getting to a place, because I think the vast majority of preachers stop before they talk about non-negotiables.
Yeah.
Because they think that that the ultimate goal of loving our neighbors requires the absence of them. And I think that becomes the generic platitude, right? But I think when we actually apply some teeth to what we're saying, that gives the loving piece even more energy and more validity in this season, right? Because
would you say that, like, so as in the scripture, I think the scripture was just such a perfect way to express this. Would you say that there can be non-negotiables that both heard from God, but they happen also to conflict in such a way that you end up having to part ways, like Paul and Silas and John Mark? I mean, would you say that there are righteous and true and faithful non-negotiables on both sides that conflict?
Yeah, I think that's the challenge, right? I think that we interpret a lot of our non-negotiables are interpreted based off of our own bias, right? So I'm not even going to say that our non-negotiables are always 100% holy or pure.
Right.
I do think that there are some, and I think that if we've seen anything over the past 4 years, we've seen that we've turned a lot of things into non-negotiables that probably aren't. But there have also been some life given to some non-negotiables that, as people of faith, I certainly don't believe there's another side of that equation, right? And so I think the challenge is discerning that. Clearly, in our postmodern world, we're going to have this issue of truth being relevant, and I'm okay with the vast majority of that, because I think that's our context of where our faith is right now in the world.
Relevant or relative?
Relative. Sorry, I said relevant. Like relative. Like I think this relative truth is just a byproduct of us living in 2020, right? And so I think the church has a responsibility to engage with that instead of just saying, like, no, there is no relative truth. But I do think that there are some non-negotiables where they can't be both, right? Like how we treat the immigrant. I'm not sure that there's a both sides to that. I don't think there are good people on both sides of that equation in terms of, like, the thinking, right? Like, I don't think that there's a reasonable faithful response that, I don't think putting children in cages and separating from their families is a faithful response. And so I think, like, for me politically, like, I have to really do my best to not just paint half the country as people who advocate for putting kids in cages, because I don't think that's the truth, right?
Right.
But I do think that I don't think that there's a balance of truth in that scenario. But I think that there is, as we saw with this is so helpful, Phil, because I think when you use real world examples for sermon illustrations, they help us, like, make sense of it easier. And, like, the Utah governors, or running, was a really good example, right? Like, we can have good political, religious, theological debate in our country. In fact, we should encourage it. Like,
totally.
We see each other as opponents and non-enemies. We've heard that rhetoric used over the past couple of days. I like having a good opponent, right? That
makes you better, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so I thought that's a really good case for us, right? It's letting go of every person who voted this way is this
right,
while also being able to say, as a church, no, we're not going to not take a stand on what happened at the border, right? Like
that I think, yeah. I mean, that I think is the issue that we come back to, is, like, painting people with a broad brush versus taking a stand on issues, and people
Right.
always should come first.
Sure.
Like, this keeps reminding me of, is it Augustine that says in essentials unity, in non-essentials diversity, in all things, wait, no, in essential, what is it?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, totally.
The one that often gets quoted from John Wesley, but probably wasn't
That
actually
is
John
not
Wesley, and probably was
Wesley.
Augustine.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's something like that.
In all things charity.
Charity.
Yeah. That's it. So unity, diversity, charity.
Yeah.
Well, I think like what we're kind of saying here, right, is that we all hold these non-negotiables. We don't often think through why, and I think that's a really important piece to be able to actually articulate why, as opposed to just like, again, reciting party tropes. And I think the Methodist Church, one of the reasons I love being, Wesleyan, is this idea of the first and foremost is do no harm. And like, that's a non-negotiable for us as a church. And when I say church, I mean White Rock, but also our denomination as a whole. And if that's going to be the one non-negotiable I'm going to establish as a denomination, I feel like it's a really good one. Like we're not always going to keep it, like we're going to fail at it. But if that's going to be our guiding principle, like if our goal is to love our neighbors, we love God, and love our neighbors, we love ourselves, and then our non-negotiable is do no harm in the midst of that, like I feel like that's a pretty solid start.
And that's exactly the guiding principle for why we are not worshiping in person.
Right.
I mean, and when we can theologically and spiritually get to a place where our non-negotiables are well thought out, and then we can actually do the best work, right? And so no, Rebecca, I was not trying to say that we were, trying to be encouraged to do something that we shouldn't be doing in worship. I thought worship was exactly what we needed. I found myself really drawn to the non-negotiable piece because I think it's the linchpin in this whole thing. Because when we follow Jesus, we will enter into conflict, and the goal in that conflict is not to pacify our feelings so that conflict can be resolved. It's to find a way to love even in the midst of the conflict. And it's just, I think Jesus, like I said, I think Jesus is really complicated, right? Because it's almost like out of one side of his mouth, Jesus is saying, love your enemies. And then out of the other side of Jesus's mouth, he's saying, like, I've come to bring a sword. Right. And it's going to be used against families. And, you're going to essentially enter into this really, really strange new family. And it's going to cause all sorts of social conflict in your life. And so I think that we hold that tension in this post-election season, recognizing that as a people of faith, the world's going to tell us a whole lot of things. And if we can keep our focus on our own faith and our own work that we're called to do, I think, if we can focus on that charity bit, we can make huge strides. And I'm writing this letter to the congregation. I'm sending it out this afternoon. It's the same thing I'm going to say in that. But ultimately, like, our work continues because our work is not defined by who wins political elections, right? And I have a lot of friends, right, in East Dallas who think like, yes, we finally did it. Trump's no longer in office. Truth is, it's not about Trump and it's not about Biden. It's about, like, can we see our neighbors as neighbors, or do we see them as like opportunities? Do we see our neighbors? Do we listen to them? Are we in relationship with them? And are we co-creating and working alongside them and the Holy Spirit to bring about the reign of God? Like, that work knows no season, right? I mean, it's not on a 4-year cycle. And I think, like, that's a really important thing for us as we move forward. Whatever our division is, if we are working side by side to bring about justice and the love of God to our neighborhood, that's where we will find healing, and that's where the best work will be done. And I thought the worship service yesterday set us up to do that really, really well. And Phil, I thought your preaching set us up to really take that to heart.
One other thing that I had in the back of my mind, especially as I was kind of concluding my sermon, was this idea of what does this message really communicate to somebody who isn't a person of faith? Like, we as a faith community really lean into this. And it's pretty easy because, like, it's rooted in the scripture. And, like, here we have this idea of love neighbor, love God, this kind of, but, like, if I'm a person that's not particularly of faith, right, and maybe not, like, really against faith, just, like, not really bought into this whole thing, like, does this idea of what really is my goal and what are my non-negotiables still play out? And that's why I said toward the end, right? Like, it's not a political affiliation. It's not even a religious affiliation. Sometimes those get in the way.
Mm-hmm.
But like, what are the things that I'm articulating and saying, this is what's really important to me and why, like, so my hope was in asking like really driving home those two things, right? What really is the goal and what really are my non-negotiables? Like, that's something that specifically applies to us in the church, but I really think it applies to everybody, right? And I hope that we in the church are providing a good example for what that really is. Like, that's my hope, is that when people are trying to figure that out and do the hard work of getting through that,
right,
and wrestling with that, we're giving an example for it. What I'm convicted at as I work through it was, are we giving people space to do that work together, whether it's in the church, whether they're in the church or they're not? And I'm not sure currently we are, and we can, try to say like, well, we're in a pandemic and we can't, hold, but like, that should be something as a church that should be convicting to us, like, how are we really bringing people together to work through these kind of questions together as a community? These are the things that happen in my head while I try to write sermons.
Love it.
It's complicated.
No, it was a great worship service, y'all. It's just, like I said, I think in my Instagram story last week, like, it's just nice to know that like the church doesn't rely on one person, and I think as the senior pastor, you kind of carry that, like, oh, if I'm not there. I've been able to shed a lot of that, and it's because I work with really great people, but also because like the church is in a good spot, and y'all were able to lead really, really well yesterday in some very turbulent times. Like, 3 years ago, I probably would have been like, no, I need to be in the pulpit. It's the Sunday after the election. But like, the truth is, like, I don't, because the Spirit moves equally among us all. And when we think we have monopoly on that work, we all have a responsibility, and some of us have different responsibilities, but we don't have monopoly on that work. And so I'm grateful for y'all and the leadership you provided our congregation yesterday.
Yeah. But final note, the closing song, Jesus in Me, loves Jesus in you. I had a friend text me and be like, that's not true. It's not so easy. It's not so easy. It's like, you're right. It's not always so easy, but it's a good reminder.
For Jesus.
That's right.
I think that's
easy for Jesus.
Jesus is loving through us. That's the point. That we don't.
Totally.
Yeah.
That's a good point, Rebecca. It is easy for Jesus,
right?
Not easy for us.
Yeah.
But we can get better at it.
And that's the work we continue.
All right, friends. Next week, more conflict talk.
Hey. Yeah, seriously, go check out the Sunday Sit Down if you missed it yesterday. It's on this podcast channel, or it's on our YouTube channel as well. I'm thrilled about Lisa Hancock. She's just such a resource.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
All right, we'll see y'all
on the flip side.
On the flippity flop. You're listening to a podcast recorded at White Rock United Methodist Church in the heart of East Dallas. For more information, you can find us at wrumc.org. And make sure you stay subscribed to this channel to stay up to date with all of our content.